Good afternoon, everyone. Hasn't it been a great summit so far? As the founding director of the Nelson and Sue Andrews Institute for Civic Leadership at Lipscomb University, I want to thank Scott for the opportunity to be involved with the summit for the last 5 years and applaud the panel last night for laying the groundwork for not only our work this week and going forward, but laying the groundwork for the presentation of this award. Last night, we were challenged to mobilize people, not just leaders, to bring about a just, equitable, sustainable world. The recipient of today's Global Athena Award, Dolores Huerta, met that challenge decades ago and has been meeting it every day since. The members of the board of Athena International are here today. We heard the challenge last night to strive for gender equity in our solutions, and that's what Athena International has been doing for over 30 years. Presenting the Global Athena Award today are Athena International President Andrea Connor, who is a summit participant, and I encourage you to get to know her, and the founder of Athena International, entrepreneur and author Martha Mertz. Please welcome Martha and Andrea to the stage.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Scott. For 36 years, Athena International has been supporting, honoring, and developing women as leaders in order that we all can achieve a balance in the voices of leadership around the globe. Today, we honor a woman whose work has impacted the culture in our country and around the world. Lots of times, people look at women and think we're pretty small in stature. This woman is small in stature, just like me, but her voice has changed the world. She exemplifies the kind of authentic leadership that we raise up. She has given voice to the voiceless. She is a fierce advocate for change and has exemplified the courage it takes to bring about change. Now, Andrea will share some of the background that Dolores brings that brings us here to honor her.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is the best part of my job. I get to introduce you to some amazing leaders, and Dolores Huerta she's just incredible. Let me tell you a little bit about her. Dolores Huerta is president and founder of the Dolores Huerta Foundation and co-founder of the United Farm Workers of America. Dolores Huerta is a labor leader and community organizer. She has worked for civil rights and social justice for over 50 years. In 1962, she and Cesar Chavez founded the United Farm Workers Union. She serves as vice president and played a critical role in many of the union's accomplishments for four decades. In 2002, she received the Puffin Nation $100,000 prize for creative citizenship, which she used to establish the Dolores Huerta Foundation. DHF is connecting groundbreaking community-based organizations to state and national movements to register and educate voters, advocate for education reform, bring about infrastructure improvement in low-income communities, advocate for greater equity for the LGBT community, and create strong leadership development. She has received numerous awards, among them the Eleanor Roosevelt Human Rights Award from President Clinton in 1998. President Obama bestowed Dolores with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award in the United States. Martha?
excuse me, for all of her accomplishments. And in the spirit of the way that Athena honors great leadership, it is my privilege to give this award to, it's the highest award that Athena International gives, to Dolores Huerta.
Thank you very much, Martha, Andrea, and the Athena organization for this wonderful, wonderful award. You know, as we go forward in our world, the one thing that we do know that we're all fighting for justice, and justice in many, many forms. One of them, of course, is food justice, what the summit has been about, the global summit, but also we want justice and equity for everybody. You know, Coretta Scott King once said that we will never have peace in the world until women take power. I'm going to amend that a little bit. I'm going to amend that phrase a little bit by just saying that feminists take power. And so when we think of what is a feminist is a person who cares about workers' rights, about women's reproductive rights, about LGBT rights, a person that cares about our environment, and yes, a person who cares about food justice in our LGBT community. In other words, a feminist is someone who cares about having a fair society, just society for everyone, so that the resources of the world can be shared equally and not just belong to the privileged few. So I think that is our challenge that we have in this world, to make sure that, but we know that the only way that we can change policies is to make sure that we elect people that can make the policy changes that we need. And in order to do that, we've got to have a continual campaign of organizing and just encouraging people and motivating them that they have to take responsibility. You know, Robert Kennedy's last words before he was assassinated were that we have a responsibility to our fellow citizens. And I think we have to take that to heart. And each and every one of us has to think, you know, and I know I'm probably speaking to the choir here, but we have to go out there and become organizers and really talk to other people and make them understand that they can make a difference in this world, that they can meet the challenges, that they actually have the power to make it happen. That you don't always have to have a college degree to make changes in the world. But if you understand that you, within yourself, have the power to make those changes, that we can make it happen. So we have a big job to do. You know, we have a lot of challenges in this world, but the one thing that we have to understand is that we can make it happen. Yes, we can. Sí se puede. Thank you very much for this honor. I appreciate it.
Dolores has many daughters and sons around the world, but she actually has her real daughter here with her today. Will you introduce her before you leave the stage?
Oh, sure. So, I have 11 children, but daughter number 8. Daughter number 8. we call this choice number 8 is here with me. She wants to say a few words.
And my name is Juanita Chavez.
Oh, and her name is Juanita Chavez.
Thank you for having us here. We met some of the women from the Athena Film Festival, which was where the documentary, Dolores, I don't know if you've heard about, there's a documentary that was produced by Carlos Santana and directed by an amazing director, Peter Bratt, that is in theaters now. I believe it's screening tonight. And that is, so Athena is where our film first, well, it premiered at Sundance, but this is where it first premiered to the public. So it was an honor to meet the women at Athena and to for them to follow up with us and be invited here today. So thank you so much for having us and for honoring my mother with this wonderful award. Thank you.
I'm going to take just one more moment, and I'm going to ask all of you a question, and I want you to give me the answer. And the question I'm going to ask you, who's got the power? And I want you to say, we've got the power. And then when I'm going to say, what kind of power? Please say people power. Can we do that? Okay, let's do it. Okay? Shout out really loud, okay? Because we want the neo-Nazis to hear us. Okay, let's go. Are you ready? Okay. Who's got the power? We got the power. What kind of power? People power. All right, let's not ever forget that. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Global Action Summit host and moderator, Fareed Zakaria, and his guest, Bruce Katz of the Brookings Institute.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's always a pleasure to be here, but it's a little daunting to be following in Dolores' footsteps. I will also add something that she told me that I think she wouldn't mind my saying, because I think it just reveals the intensity of her commitment, the vibrancy of her life. Dolores is 87 years old, so please watch very carefully what she is eating and follow suit, because that is the key to, obviously, a very long, productive, and successful life. We are going to now talk a little bit about all the kinds of issues that Scott has kind of placed on the agenda at this extraordinary conference, which is now 5 years, 4 years, 6 years on, and each year gets better and bigger, and in every way, what we are trying to talk about is sustainable solutions that allow you to incorporate innovation, demographic pressures, take advantage of technological opportunities, and use the reality of politics to your advantage rather than your disadvantage. Right? I mean, that's what we're all trying to figure out, how to make all that work. Bruce Katz is one of the smartest people I know who really approaches things from a solution-oriented perspective. You know, we can all, in the business of being kind of policy intellectuals, pundits, journalists, we are fantastic at criticizing. We can tell you all the problems with everything. What is more difficult is to come up with a solution. And Bruce is really, I think, peerless in being able to do that. So I'm not going to go through a long CV. I'm just going to say that you run a center at Brookings that deals with cities. And I want you to talk first about your previous project, the Metropolitan Revolution, right, which really, in some ways, is at the kind of the starting point, which is, we think of politics, we think of America as very dysfunctional, right? And one of the things Bruce does is he opens your eyes to something that I think we all have this basic sense of, wait a minute, if America is so dysfunctional, how come it seems kind of vibrant, right? I mean, there's this kind of, James Fallows did a wonderful piece for the Atlantic magazine where he flew over America in a small single-engine plane that he and his wife piloted. And they stopped in 22 small cities in the United States. And everywhere they would ask people this question, how is America doing? And everyone would say, oh, terrible, oh my God, it's just, we're going down. This is the collapse of the Roman Empire. This is the end of days. This is, you know. And then he'd say, and how are things here in Sioux Falls? And they'd say, oh, fantastic. We're doing great. Right. We've come up with these innovative public-private partnerships. We're reaching across the aisle. And he said, I found that again and again and again. And so, in a sense, Bruce, the first question is, what is that paradox and why does it exist?
Well, in some ways, first of all, thanks to Scott for inviting me, and it's wonderful to be with you. It really follows what Dolores just said. When we think about power, the first thing people think about is the hierarchy of power. which is the power really is vested at the federal level or maybe in the states. But increasingly, first Jennifer Bradley at the Metropolitan Revolution and this new book I have, The New Localism with Jeremy Nowak, what we're basically positing is that power belongs to the problem solvers. And the problem solvers primarily congregate and concentrate in city and metropolitan areas. And when you think about government, the federal government or the states, they're just governments. They can be hijacked by partisanship, and they have been. They can be riven by ideological polarization, and they have been. But at the city and metropolitan scale, no matter what the size, these are not governments. They're really networks of institutions and leaders, public, private, civic, university, community, environmental, labor. And you get rewarded for getting stuff done at this level. At the higher level, you get rewarded by partisan allegiance and ideological purity. So we think something transformative is happening not only in this country, but really across the world in terms of the shifting of power down from the nation to the local and across from the public to the public-private civic.
Why do you think, so much of the world now is more global in the sense that we're all interacting with the world, but you point out correctly, it seems to me, that the power is shifting locally. What explains that divide? We have global aspirations, but local solutions.
Well, I think globalization, to some extent, has undermined the power of the nation state. You see this in multiple levels. I think from our perspective, what we tend to focus on is that the market and demographics want proximity. They want density. They want to concentrate assets because that's how you innovate. That's how you sort of push the world forward, irrespective of what your issue is or the challenge you're trying to solve or the opportunity you're trying to leverage. So there's sort of a natural dynamic in the world today. Even though we're all hyper-connected, we actually need to be close to each other. I just spent the morning going around the greater downtown of Nashville, which is going through a dramatic transformation. I mean, a remarkable transformation. And unused properties, underused assets, they're all being leveraged towards being a strong, vibrant, robust core, more companies, more jobs, more tax revenues, that then at this level can be used to fund all the kinds of services and activities we need for children, young adults, the elderly in this community. So there's this weird kind of disconnect or juxtaposition between hyperconnectivity, the world is flat, so to speak, and hyper-concentration, the world is spiky.
Explain the trend lines first, just so we understand them, because somebody like Joel Kotkin will say that people like you who celebrate kind of the new urbanists, you get it all wrong, that fundamentally what is happening is that most Americans are still moving on the basis of three things, really: weather, the cost of real estate, and taxes. Right. And what that means is that they are moving south and southwest, not concentrating in big cities. It's the people who like to write and read. It's people like us who have this illusion that cities are thriving, but actually they're dying.
So first of all, Joel's a friend, and I think what I focus on is really metropolitan America. And one thing about the United States is we are the most metropolitan of nations. So you think about cities and the broader metropolitan areas. And we have 388 of them, by the way. The top 100 alone is 2/3 of our population, 3/4 of our GDP, and over 90% on every indicator that would matter to our economy being successful. When you add up the top, all 388, 84% of the population, 91% of the GDP. And their core cities, older suburbs, the mature suburbs we built in the 1970s, the exurbs we built in the 1990s, and rural areas at the periphery. So incredibly, about half of people who live in rural America by density concentration actually live in metropolitan areas because they're now commuting zones. So if we're going to solve the urban-rural rift, it won't be by national politicians or parties that tend to divide us. It'll be at this level. So Joel is looking at residential resettlement, whether within metropolitan areas, we're still a suburban nation primarily, or across regions of the country. What I primarily focus on is literally only about 250 square miles in the United States. The US, if anyone wants again to take an exam, 3.8 million square miles. I focus on 250.
But that 250 houses, as you say, about, what was that, 75% of the population?
Well,
Like
this
that
is
100
really, this is within those metros, this is the innovation platform. If you want to find our advanced research universities, if you want to find our advanced medical facilities, if you want to find our global companies, they're in relatively small geographies in the United States, and actually the rest of the world is quite different from us. It tends to be a little more dispersed than us. So our power, we may have residents spread out across the metropolitan area. We may have labor markets at the metropolitan scale or housing markets at the metropolitan scale. But the power of this country is off of a relatively tight fulcrum. Small geographies that pack a powerful punch.
And why is it, do you think that this has something to do with American federalism? That, you know, unlike a country like France, where there's Paris, in the United States there are 30 reasonably sized cities that could be considered, you know, kind of at some level or the other, world class, you know, it's very different. Germany is the only country I can think of that is like that.
I think it absolutely has to do with the genius of our federal republic, where power is so diffused. Everyone's in charge, really, when you think about it. And if you want to take any particular given challenge we have, you know, whether it's around climate, whether it's around social mobility, whether it's around managing demographic transformation, investing in infrastructure, you know, we don't really look up. This is not Britain. You know, this is not a centralized government with 3 ministers sort of making decisions about their countries. We have thousands of people, tens of thousands, who make critical decisions about how we resolve some of these big challenges or leverage opportunities. That's our genius.
Right. This is not an accident of history. Moynihan, you quote that famous line of Moynihan's where he says, the United States has a federal system not because the founding fathers couldn't think of anything better and we didn't have telephones. And so they came up with a way of having local control. It's because they believe deeply that government that is closest to you governs best.
Absolutely. So localism is sort of baked into the U.S. And you could argue that the period when the national government really built itself out, starting in the 30s with the Depression, moving through World War II, and after the Second World War, when we made these incredible investments in research and development at the national level, and we still do, that may look like, 50 years on as an aberration. And really, we're returning to a period where so much of the power vests locally. So I think a lot of folks think about the rise of the city-state or metropolitan areas as a cyclical event. Well, the federal government, like Elvis, has left the building, so we now have to step into the vacuum. I think it's actually more structural. I think it's built into our system, and if you have to solve these audacious challenges of the 21st century, they don't get solved by compartmentalized agencies. It's not like you can hand over the environmental agenda or the climate agenda to EPA. You really have to think about it in terms of transport and housing and buildings and renewable energy. That cuts across multiple disciplines and sectors. This is the level where you get that holistic perspective.
Let's talk about some of the examples where this sort of works well. In some ways, Pittsburgh, I would say, is the poster child, because it really is a case of pretty steep decline and now pretty steep recovery. So describe what you think happened.
Yeah, Pittsburgh is a remarkable story because when deindustrialization hit with the steel industry, it was like that. I mean, late 1970s, just a complete collapse of the steel sector in Pittsburgh, loss of substantial number of jobs. What has begun to happen over the past 40 years is business philanthropy, universities. They've got Carnegie Mellon, right? They've got Pitt, others, more liberal arts schools, and the public sector came together to begin to invest in the future. They built these centers of excellence in their universities, and both of the major ones, around robotics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, computer science. I mean, I have to tell you, at the time, I don't think anyone even knew what they were investing in. They were investing in people, and they were investing in, well, maybe this will come to pass as a next generation technology that will start in the lab, then get prototyped, and then be adopted in a ubiquitous manner. They understood that if they were the city on the ground floor of a technology or set of technologies that would rip through the world, they would be very wealthy. You know, Uber's in Pittsburgh now testing driverless cars, not just because it's a hilly place, and if it can work there, it can work anywhere, but they need to be near the secret sauce. Really smart faculty, really smart students, incredibly entrepreneurial companies, and a philanthropic community that is putting their money into future investment. So it's a 40-year story. We just see the end product and everyone, what's going on in Pittsburgh? It must be because, you know, it's a beautiful place and it's got a lot of amenities and it's got all these neighborhoods and millennials want to be there. Yes, but it's also smart, strategic investment for the long haul in advanced innovation. When you do that and you do it at scale and you do it over a sustained period of time, your entire city and metropolitan area benefits.
What about, though, the issue that most people think is, at some level, one that the federal government has always dealt with, which is the big-ticket infrastructure item?
Right.
That, you know, we all look at America and we all see the infrastructure crumbling. We all travel abroad and we all notice that at this point, you know, leave Europe aside and China aside, but, you know, you go to Turkey and the infrastructure is much better than in the United States. How do you solve that problem? Is it getting solved, and is localism the answer?
I think localism is the answer, actually, and I think there's a lot of different kinds of infrastructure on the transport side, the energy side, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, when you add it all up, the national government only pays about 25 cents of every dollar on infrastructure. So even though we think we need a big infrastructure bill at the federal level, and I used to be the counsel to the Senate Housing Subcommittee that actually put together ICE-T, which was the big transit, highway bill in 1990s that still sort of plays itself out today. For the most part, infrastructure is designed, financed, and delivered at the local level by a mix of public-private. And the constraint here is really not that the national government is not investing enough. It's that we haven't figured out a way to unlock the wealth of our cities and metropolitan areas. I'll just give you an example from Europe. So Copenhagen, how many people have been to Copenhagen? So a good number of people sort of recognize this place. The biggest danger in Copenhagen is to get out of your hotel or apartment and get hit by a bike in the morning, right? About half the people commute to work by biking. The real success of Copenhagen, going back 30 years, 18% unemployment. Unemployment in Nashville today is about 2.2%. And the city was essentially bankrupt. They could not basically impose taxes on their citizens, and the national government didn't want to do it either. What they did is they transferred the public assets, the land they owned between the downtown and the airport and along the harbor, to one publicly owned, privately driven corporation. And this corporation was basically tasked with overseeing the redevelopment of the harbor and this area called Oristad. And the revenues from land sales and leases would be used for one purpose: to build a state-of-the-art transit system, which they are now doing in Copenhagen. So what do we have in the United States? If you go to New York City, and we were just talking about this, you have the New York, New Jersey Public Authority, right? The Port Authority. It's a patronage dump, number one, right? And investment decisions are made by politicians for political reasons, not for market reasons, right? And the yield from what they do is therefore depressed, and it doesn't go to finance like something I would like, remake LaGuardia, remake JFK, remake just about anything which is broken in New York. So Copenhagen, Hamburg, Helsinki, most of the Northern Europeans and Singapore have figured out a structural mechanism to unlock public wealth and take the yield and put it towards infrastructure investment. And we can do this.
The interesting thing that you remind us of is that in this respect, the United States is actually less market-friendly than most European and Asian countries.
It's incredible. I mean, we have social democrats in control in Hamburg and Copenhagen that are basically manipulating the market, right? So that they can build world-class cities with world-class infrastructure. We act as if we're like, you know, the sort of top of the capitalist heap, and we haven't really figured this out. We're dealing with legacy institutions that are not working hard enough for us at the local level.
And the way we build infrastructure still is essentially socialist. The government conceives of it, plans for it, pays for it, and builds it. Whereas if you look at, you know, airports around the world, they're privatized. Roads,
absolutely,
transport systems.
Absolutely. So look, I think what's going to happen, I think, you know, when Trump talked about the deconstruction of the administrative state, or Steve Bannon talked about it, I think what's going to happen in this period is we're going to see an acceleration of the rise of the city-state. Dozens, hundreds of cities and metropolitan areas in the United States, because they're forced to, are going to adapt and adopt the best structural innovations coming out of Europe and out of Asia. We are still the land of product innovation, right? I mean, we're just an incredibly innovative country off the base of high levels of military and health research. But I think what we need to do now is govern collectively across sectors in a radically different way. And that's primarily what we're writing about now.
So let's talk about that, the divide that, in a sense, that you know, is in the title of your book, the localism in the age of populism. Right. So I don't know if you'll correct me on the numbers, but the statistic I saw was that the top 200 cities in the United States occupy 5% of the landmass,
right, sure,
something like that. So there's the other 95%, but when I say 95, I mean 95% of the land, but maybe 35, 40% of the people.
Huge portion of the population.
And they feel locked out, or they feel disregarded, or they feel looked down on. You know, that part of what's happened here is your predictions have come true to an even greater extent than one might imagine, and the rest of America understands it. I remember after Trump won, there was a blog posting that I was fascinated by, and I quoted from, because it was this guy in rural America saying, just imagine what life looks like for me. Every song I hear is some hip song, you know, hip hop, rap, whatever. It comes out of a city. Every movie now comes out of a city. Every sitcom, every drama is set in a city. Every innovation comes out of a city. You know, not just technological, but how we're supposed to live our lives. You know, whether it's go to Starbucks, do yoga, do, you know, whatever it is. And he said, and here we are, not of the city. Talk about that divide between a rural, you know, mentality almost and an urban mentality.
Yeah, I think in the broader construct, I think populism is a way to exploit those kind of grievances. You know, cultural anxiety, economic insecurity. New localism is really meant to solve problems. And because so much of rural America or small town America really lives in the envelope of metropolitan areas, because these are just commuter sheds, right? That's all they are. They're just large labor markets and large sort of resource markets, so to speak. I think this is the level where we finally can understand and then sort of build on the integration of the urban and the rural economies, or the urban and suburban economies. We've got to do it at this level, because I think the politicians and the parties and the ideologies and the factions will continue to exploit the divisions. This is the level where we can understand what unites us. I mean, it's incredible. You've got a whole, you know, forum here on food and health and prosperity, Well, maybe there'll be a bit of urban gardening going on, but for the most part, the cities are not going to be the, areas from where our food comes from. So I think we have an opportunity at this level to really understand the intricate relationships from an economic perspective across these different kind of geographies, and then begin to connect us together again. That's the power of new localism. If we do this for the next 5, 10, 15, 25 years, we can take back our country, and we can begin to have a much more civil discourse, and more importantly, have the national government in the states do what they're supposed to do.
Does that solution involve building? I guess there are two ways to think about this. One is to invest in centers of innovation in the city to try to create a larger and larger penumbra that will encompass the rural areas. And the other is to invest in the rural communities. I ask you this question, I'll tell you one anecdote, which I think is instructive in this regard. I once asked Mike Bloomberg, what was the difference between running a business and running a city and being in government? And he said, the fundamental thing I notice is that when you're in a business, if something is not doing well, you defund it. You stop funding it, you starve it of funds, and you double up on the places that are working. He said, when you're in politics, it's almost the opposite, right? Upstate New York is not doing well. The business response would be, kill it. And, the people in upstate New York have to move somewhere. But we do the opposite. We try to find all kinds of ways to subsidize it. So from a purely business point of view, you'd be saying you're subsidizing failure. But that's not, of course, and he wasn't implying that that's what you should do. He was saying, but as a political matter, those are real communities. And so you have to figure out, so what is the solution to that?
So my view of the world is that if you think about the envelope of most major metropolitan areas. Let's just start with the major ones. At 100 square miles, you have the sort of resource, or 100 miles, you've got the sort of resources coming in. At 40 miles, you've got labor markets. Then you collapse down to the 1 square mile, which is where your knowledge-intensive industries are. There's a natural division of responsibilities of what different bits of your metropolitan area does. We're not going to put large-scale production or distribution in the cores of our cities. I mean, we're going to put that more at the periphery. The better the innovation machine of the core does, the more likely we're going to create certain kinds of jobs, and in many cases, good jobs, for other parts of the metropolitan area. So we need to think through in a much more granular way, what is the responsibility of different kinds of geographies, right? Denser places with advanced research institutions have a certain responsibility. Areas with large amounts of land close to sort of road and rail infrastructure, maybe even air infrastructure, have a different kind of responsibility or possibility. I think we focus too much on the divisions between cities, suburb, jurisdiction, county, and less on just what different places do well. And the better the city is doing, the core of the city on its innovation job, because that's its job really, the more likely we're going to generate more employment opportunities, both within the city and closer to where many people actually live.
What about technology? What does technology do in this kind of world? And I'm thinking, for example, about a technology like a platform like Amazon,
right,
which is wondrous and amazing. Jeff Bezos is now the richest man in the world. But I think about how it has disintermediated all these local companies. So every little town in America had a hardware store. They probably have, the bigger ones would have a bookshop. And all those stores, the local community that was built around the little main street, half those stores are empty because of platforms like Amazon. Is technology the problem or the solution?
Yeah, I think we have we have a huge disconnect between wages and prices in the United States. Our economy is not producing enough jobs that pay people sufficient incomes so that they can dispose of those incomes at these local stores. I mean, to a large extent, you know, whether it's Amazon, whether it's Walmart, whether it's other big box, you know, retailers, they, with a lot of their products coming from China and elsewhere, it is helping to resolve in ways that I don't think is normally understood, this complete disconnect between wages and prices. We have got to get back to an economic model where we are basically spurring the growth of jobs with quality wages and quality benefits. I'm not trying to skirt the Amazon issue, but I think we've got a jobs challenge in the United States. And I personally think that because we haven't quite understood the different roles of different parts of metropolitan areas, we have under-leveraged the opportunity to really have an employment growth spurt in the US. I look at most cores of cities because that tends to be my expertise. I think in the next 10 years, we could have a 2x growth in jobs. Not just relocation of jobs, I'm talking about new jobs built through new innovation technologies that are creating new opportunities for a large portion of our workforce. And by the way, when I use the term innovation economy or STEM economy or STEAM economy, more than half of those jobs can be occupied by people without four-year college degrees. What they need are credentials, usually out of community colleges. Those are the workhorses of our country. So I think Amazon has basically, and others, both through technology, smart business practices, have been able to sort of exploit this sort of growing gap between wages and prices. Right. And I think we've got to grow, literally grow the middle class again in the United States. And that will create more demand for local business. And there are many smart ways in which we can do that at this level. I don't think this is a national program or even a state program. It's really at this level that these kind of establishments get spurred.
I think when you talk about wages and prices, it's a very nice way to think about it, because I didn't mean to pick on Amazon. Uber is another perfect example. What Uber does basically is it depresses the wages of tens of thousands of taxi drivers all over the world, but it lowers the prices for hundreds of thousands of consumers. So you benefit as a consumer, but as a producer of those services, you are under terrific wage pressure. I mean, the reason we've been living in 25 years of essentially zero inflation is because that global deflation machine that these technology platforms occupy is just so powerful. I wonder whether we need a different economic model or a different way of thinking about the economy that is much more employment friendly. I mean, we judge everything, for example, on GDP. But what if you can generate more and more GDP without generating many jobs? How do you create that metric? How do you create even that mindset that says the most important thing is not to grow your GDP. The most important thing is to give everyone a living wage. The Germans, again, do it a little bit more than we do. Yeah. So in the Great Recession, the German government told companies, don't fire people. If you decrease people's wages and their hours, will make up the difference. Companies felt like we benefit because we don't have to go through the cycle of retraining new workers when the cycle picks up. The workers obviously benefited, and the government actually argued, persuasively to my mind, that it would actually cost them less than the unemployment insurance. So the whole thing was a win-win, but it was because the metric that they were using to measure was employment, not GDP. Because it meant very bad GDP growth, because you didn't have that V-shaped recession and recovery.
I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of our metrics are anachronistic. And the other thing the Germans have done is they've built this apprenticeship system and this vocational education system, which really honors the dignity of work and gives, incredible numbers of, or incredible shares of their population the ability to realize their full potential, right? Not by going to a four-year college or liberal art, which I don't want to dismiss that. But, a lot of these kids are growing up, particularly given the technologies now that everyone has access to. They're growing up tinkering and playing and, inventing. And, the German system is more likely, first of all, it's incredibly flexible, but more likely to allow that portion of their student base to sort of act upon what is their natural interests. Right. So I think We need to rethink our metrics. As I was saying before with the Copenhagen example, we need to modernize and repurpose our institutions. I tend to be maybe too much of an optimist, frankly, about how much we can accomplish, not just in this country, but in cities writ large. And part of the reason I'm optimistic is that, cities collectively are a big learning laboratory. All cities sort of are watching each other. Who's doing this? Who's doing that? And then they just shamelessly just plagiarize it. They just steal ideas from other cities and say, great, we're going to adopt it to Nashville, and we're going to do even better. And I think that's a different kind of learning and a different kind of transferability than an old model of waiting, for your national legislature to do something. When was the last time that happened? It's just a different model for public or public-private innovation to occur. It's faster, and it's frankly, more inventive at the end of the day.
One final question before I open it up to all of you. A friend of mine he's a preacher, so he's got a lot of practice doing public speaking. He says, in the middle of your talk, always say, in conclusion. It wakes the audience right up. So, but this is not the middle, don't worry. Talk about that last piece that we've just been talking about labor, because it seems to me that one of the things, and it relates so completely, I think, to this issue of food, health, and sustainability, is what should we do, and are you noticing places where this is working, where we are giving semi-skilled and differently skilled labor the wages and dignity that it needs in this new economy? Because technology makes it so that so many of the things that people used to do, machines are now doing. So we now have to ask ourselves, what is it that human beings can do that machines can't do? So I was talking to a guy who's running a chain of hospitals in India, and he said, we literally need 10 times the number of doctors we have. He has 18 hospitals. And so instead what we're doing is we're using Watson, the IBM AI system. And the result is that, and we've tested it 1,000 times, the diagnostics that the machine provides are better. Because the machine is looking at 2 million cases. No doctor can remember more than a few hundred. So he says what we do is we have the machine do the diagnostics, but now we need doctors as almost life coaches, nurses as life coaches to help the patient through that process. And we need to train people to do that. We need to pay them properly for it. We need to give them the sense of dignity that comes with it. And I felt like that was a metaphor for our economy as a whole. We've got to figure out all these jobs in agriculture, in hospitality, in health, but in the human touch part of health, and find a way to organize it properly, pay people properly, and to my mind, perhaps as importantly, give people a sense of upward mobility and dignity about it. That these are not kind of dead-end, low-skilled jobs that you do because you can't do anything else, because it's going to be half the population.
So, first of all, I think this is really the essential question. I tend to divide it up into 3 categories, which is obviously completely simplistic, but just follow this along. The public sector needs to invest in infrastructure writ large. We have a $4 trillion deficit in this country because we did not invest because we thought the feds were going to do it, which was absurd. So we're going to have to do this primarily from the local level. If we can get to that $4 trillion number, I think we can, because I think we can unlock public wealth. That will create millions of jobs. And we're talking transport, energy, water, so, across multiple levels.
And it's not just construction work. People
not just construction.
Because somebody has to operate these systems on a day-to-day basis.
And these are very technologically sophisticated systems now. So that's the public possibility. The private possibility is to take innovation to true scale. We invest about $250 billion a year in military health, because the federal government, for the most part, is a healthcare company with an army, so it does have an R&D component, right? So we invest quite a bit in R&D. We're not creating the jobs off that base that we could, city after city, metro after metro. So we need a commercialization jump, right? particularly that fits our demographic transformation. And the last part is, I think, where the Europeans will invent. There are a bunch of jobs that are not coming back, and the Finns are beginning to invent citizen salaries, play around with community engagement, different kinds of jobs. And so I think we have to move across all three, and we have to do it at this level, because we're not going to have, I mean, you know, we're the United States. We don't have a national plan. You know, our idea of planning is lunch, you know? We don't have a long-term vision. So we're going to have to, at this level, pull together all these different sectors and disciplines and intelligence and capital and push this forward. And then we'll create the new norms and the routines that the markets will essentially engage.
Yeah, the federal government, I think, is even worse than you described. It's an insurance company with an army.
Absolutely.
It's not even a healthcare company.
Absolutely.
All right. Questions, comments? Ma'am, behind Scott? Yeah. Do we have mics, or do you guys have? Yeah, we do have a mic. Let's make sure so everyone can hear.
Several of the speakers have talked about all of our hope to have long lives and health and vibrant years to come. So often we think of formalized education as something that young people do, and if we're going to have a stackable credentials kind of world, what do we have to do to make the expectation among folks that you're constantly having to retrain? There's just not a career anymore where one set of credentials are going to last. Certainly not if we're all going to try to live longer. And do you see that being a public sector or a private sector responsibility?
Well, I think it's a mix, actually. And again, I think what you're describing is a demographic transformation, which is underway, just not in this country. It's underway in many of the advanced mature economies. You know, one thing to take a look at if you want to Google is the age distribution of the United States versus Germany versus Japan versus Niger versus other parts of Africa. I mean, you know, they are the African cities which are emerging are the classic pyramid. The bulk of their population are the younger ages. We're sort of more sort of evenly divided across the different age cohorts. I think we're at the beginning of the revolution of lifelong learning, right? We don't, you know, and this will happen again at this level. It'll happen here. And it'll happen with intermediaries or institutions that exist for certain purposes. It could be the libraries, frankly, right, which are completely repurposing themselves, beginning to take on new roles and responsibilities to adapt to a changing demographics, right? And so it'll be a classic way in which innovation occurs today of the type you're describing. It fundamentally needs to be public, private, and civic. You have to have a first mover, say Nashville, let's just pick a random place, right? Sort of beginning to invent on this. And then you'll capture it, you'll codify it, you'll figure out what enabled it, what worked, what didn't. Then you'll have a group of fast followers, maybe another 3 or 5 or 7 or 10 cities, either here or elsewhere, and then it'll go to market, to scale. That's the way things are going to happen now. And any place, which is a brilliant example, any place that has the ground floor of that becomes an export service. You become really good at it, and everyone comes to Nashville to say, what's going on? You know, how do we replicate this? How do we adapt it? So this is one of these periods where we don't lack the intelligence, we don't lack the smarts, we don't lack the technology. In this country, we don't lack the capital. But we do have to collaborate to compete and collaborate to innovate around these challenges and just get rid of the notion that someone in Washington is going to solve something. Gone. It's over for the foreseeable future. And I worked in the federal government for 10 years, and we had a good run. But I'm not looking for them to do anything but harm right now. So I think we just need to understand that and adapt.
Yeah.
Bruce, who do you think is going to go Copenhagen first in the United States? Which metropolitan area?
That's a really good question. So I think here's the way it could happen. It's either a place that is completely desperate, Hartford, Connecticut, right? Which is, if it's not bankrupt today, it will be bankrupt tomorrow. And it's got all this waterfront that's owned by all these disparate agencies, public agencies, that could be repurposed for a different economy. Or it's a place like Pittsburgh that is seeing sort of a growth trajectory and now is hitting a bunch of public assets. I mean, if you go to Pittsburgh right now and you go to Uber's headquarters and what's called Robot Row in Lawrenceville, this is like where the robotics industry in the United States is congregating. Across the street from these corporations is a tow pound. I mean, this is if you're stupid enough to have your car towed in Pittsburgh, this is where it goes. Like a substantial amount of riverfront property owned by the city government and the county. Or that's where they park the sanitation trucks at night or the police cars at night. Well, this is not your highest and best use, right? Well, there are many examples of that in these cities that are growing and are hitting up against a public asset that can be used in a smarter way. Or it's your high-flying cities. I mean, take a New York, which clearly needs to invest in infrastructure, as we described. And I think there's since the Port Authority is probably the worst example of a public authority in the United States right now, I think a publicly owned, privately driven port authority in New York, New Jersey could unlock hundreds of billions of dollars. That's the Copenhagen model.
But let me ask you about this, because people think, yes, but aren't there some things that are so expensive or so for example, New York has added 3 subway stations in the last 70 years. And those, thanks to Michael Bloomberg. China, the Shanghai system is adding something like 40 or 50 a year for the next 10 years. Do you, at some level, does the government, because I understand there's a lot of waterfront property in Manhattan that is used for sanitation and sewage plants. There's airports, but something like the subway system. Are you sort of presenting a happy news scenario, or are there some places where you just have to bite the bullet and spend the money?
Well, I think what I'm saying is there's a different way to raise capital. And I think the old US model is, I guess we're going to have to tax, and I think we are going to have to do that. You're going to have on the ballot in Nashville a $5.2 billion referendum for transit. Vote for it. You got to do it. But you've got to move beyond that. And the way to move beyond that in a sustainable way is to understand not just what the government owes, but what the government owns. Yeah. Because the government in this country owns about 25% of the real estate in most cities and metropolitan areas. And trust me, we are not getting the highest and best use of it. And we're not getting the yield for smartly managing those public assets to pay for our children and pay for infrastructure.
And probably there's going to be more coming out as technology. For example, the post office. I mean, you have these huge, beautiful buildings in the center of almost every city, which obviously should be used for something other than having filing clerks doing something that FedEx does much better. In fact, they're subcontracting most of the work to FedEx, right?
Yeah, so I think once we start thinking about public wealth, and again, how to basically leverage what the public owns. The real difference with Copenhagen is in Copenhagen, they made the hard political choice of taking all the assets that was owned by the national government, the local government, by different agencies, and shifting under one integrated corporation. Here, we have a port authority, airport authority, redevelopment authority, convention authority, stadia authority, parking authority. Everyone's in charge, no one's in charge. So we're going to have our mayors and county leaders at least align the disposition strategies of these different authorities, but someone, probably a place in deep distress, is going to ultimately unify them, and that will become a new norm for how we operate.
Ma'am, if you can get the mic. No, we have it. It's a large enough room that I think it'd be.
Hi, I'm Liz from Oxfam. I'm wondering if you could talk about the changing nature of the social contract between business and labor and how that affects things. If we think about jobs 60 years ago, manufacturing, high unionization, and the difference between the CEO and the lowest paid worker, that's completely changed. And there's some people who say businesses could make a decision that we're going to pay a living wage. How would that affect what we're talking about?
Well, again, I think this gets back to the earlier conversation about Germany, frankly, or a good portion of Northern Europe, where you don't see this disconnect between the wages of the CEOs and the wages of, quote unquote, the line worker, which is probably an anachronistic term. So it gets back to rethink what is prosperity. I mean, these are fundamental questions. And I think that instability in this country is because of this growing gap, right, between the folks who are basically reaping the benefits from this disruptive period and a large portion of our country who really don't see the future for themselves or for their children. So I think we are going to have to get to a different kind of social contract. I just don't believe it's going to happen at higher levels of government because the parties are almost built in different ends of the ideological spectrum to exploit grievances. This is the level built to solve problems. So this is the kind of problem, as hard as it is to resolve at this level, that we're going to have to test and market new ways. And I'm focusing on employment opportunity because if we were at the end of our ability to create quality jobs, this would be a different conversation. I think we have not leveraged our opportunity. I mean, we're like a 40% efficiency in terms of really creating the kind of jobs we could create. As we're doing that I think drives this new conversation about management and labor, right? I mean, but let's not have that conversation in a static way. Let's have it in a way where we're really putting on the jobs and innovation machine and getting the full bang for it.
And I think some of that is culture and norms. Northern Europe, the gap is not that big, not because there's any law. Yeah. Ironically, the only two places where they either have a law or thinking of having a law are the United States and Britain, which is a perfect example that people always say when you want to figure out what was widely prevalent in ancient societies, look at the laws that were on the books. Because if they have a law, it probably meant there was a lot of it going on, which is why you had a law. And if you were to ask yourself, the two countries that might end up with laws about CEO to worker ratios are Britain and the United States because they have them. I mean, part of the issue I've always thought is I don't think anyone thinks it's a good idea for the government to make those decisions, but it seems, a kind of abdication of moral leadership for a CEO not to ask himself, should I really be paid 500 times what the average worker in my company does? And the argument that this is what capitalism requires is belied by the examples in Europe where there are lots of very, very profitable companies where the ratio is more like 50 to 1 or 100 to 1. So how we get back, I mean, in a way, that's the interesting part of your question, which is how do we get back to a conversation which says the fact that it is legal to do something does not give license to every CEO to do it. I mean, this is in some ways what caused the financial crisis. Everybody's saying, yeah, but these triple derivative products were legal. But how come nobody asks, yeah, but, were they the right thing to do? And how do we get back to a conversation about capitalism that reminds us, that Adam Smith's first book was on moral philosophy. It was not just about what can you get away with, but what is, capitalism was in many ways for him a very deeply moral framework because it unlocked human freedom, but not without human responsibility. So, again, let's just make sure it's a large enough room, and I think people will benefit from hearing. I'm sorry, did I take the mic away from you? We'll come back to you. We'll come back to you, sir.
Sorry, hi. Very interested in what you said in Pittsburgh, but I'm trying to get my head around it and trying to understand it because I was reading about Pittsburgh for something I was doing the other day, and over the last sort of 35 years, population of Pittsburgh has halved. The labor market is stagnant. The number of jobs is continuing to decline, and the per capita income is below $19,000 compared to $31,000 in Nashville. So I'm just understanding how that is a success story.
Well, Pittsburgh has, I think, the third highest millennial growth rate in the United States right now. So what you're describing in a part is still the effect of this massive deindustrialization which caused a population migration to other parts of the country, for the most part, primarily south, So they have shrunk. The city was 650,000. It's now down to 300,000, right? It was a brutal restructuring of their economy, hit bottom, beginning to come up. And so what we're describing is a rejuvenation and a renewal story in process, right? It's not at the end of its process, but it's a signal to a lot of industrial cities and to places that were even worse off, take a Detroit, take a St. Louis, that there is a way back. The way back is to try not to copy someone else. The way back is to be the best 21st century version of yourself. And that's really about this interesting mix of next generation technologies, production. And you know, Pittsburgh has one of the largest healthcare systems, UPMC, et cetera, which is testing a lot of new, like Nashville is. Actually, there's a lot of similarities. A lot of new services, new ways of delivering that will ultimately sort of move across the U.S. and the world. So Pittsburgh is a work in progress still, but we want to see it's coming back.
We got to get one more question from the gentleman whose mic I stole.
So we just spoke about Copenhagen model, and then so we're just talking about the national parks to become, privatized. So where do you see that? Because it costs 0.1% of a military spending that you have, and at the same time, 25% of the federal land is also includes parks. I don't know how the capitalism really would work into that, and how does it really lend itself? So.
Well, I think look to cities for how we're beginning to manage different kinds of assets. In many of our cities, the parks are now managed by conservancies, nonprofit conservancies that have been delegated certain responsibilities by the public and still have oversight from the public. A lot of our downtowns are managed by business improvement districts that have the ability to tax their merchants so that they can invest in clean and safe and be a platform for greater growth, more tax revenue for the city as a whole. So I have a sense, and the national level is generally the worst place to try this stuff because it's driven more by partisan and ideological differences. And at the local level, it's driven by the desire to get something done in the most efficient and effective way and redefine public and private in a way that's closer to how our country actually works than what we might read about in a textbook. So I do think that we're about to repurpose a group of institutions in the US at this level, create a new set of institutions that are really 21st century in nature, which means they're cross-sectoral, multidisciplinary, really built to solve problems, right? And maybe that'll drift up to the national level. But I think we're going to go through a period in the US where the national government it's not frozen in formaldehyde, but it's just battling between these ideological factions and partisan divisions. But if we have enough of this bubbling of experimentation and innovation and new models, it will, particularly if we can get beyond the urban-rural rift within these metropolitan areas, that is going to affect how our states operate first and ultimately how the national government operates.
And it seems to me that, correct me if I'm wrong, Bruce, but we're going to see one more big push toward localism, push toward local solutions, because, look, there's a very good chance we are going to end up with a $1.5 trillion tax cut at the federal level. This is going to starve the federal government of resources, but these things have to happen. Right. And so, one of the kind of magic games we play in the United States is you get these massive tax cuts, and this has been true for 35 years now, but then people still want the functions that government provides, and they are increasingly provided at the local level, and local taxes go up and local fees go up because somebody has to pay for this stuff.
And I think at the end of the day, the public understands that. And so the mischief of Washington ultimately, again, I think is going to accelerate more local experimentation and lead to sort of the need to finally look at some of these models that have been invented outside the United States and adapt and tailor them to our own culture and our own legal system and governance regimes. The product of that will be enormous amount of capital that we can use to invest. It's there. And if Nashville wants to be the first place to sort of invent and adapt the Copenhagen model, that will redound to your benefit. I mean, this is the great thing about the US. We compete to innovate, both at the individual level, at the company level, and frankly, at the metropolitan level. And this is a moment, partly because of the stupidity in Washington, where that's going to be put on steroids.
All right, so next year at the Global Action Summit, Scott is going to announce Nashville is going to take over the Copenhagen model. Bruce Katz, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you all very much.
Last night we were way up.